Last night, Kyiv took the worst pounding of the entire war. The mayor said as much himself. And across the country, military airfields that had sat untouched for 4.5 years suddenly became targets. The obvious question isn't really, why did this happen? It's, why now? Why wait 4.5 years to hit airfields that were presumably valuable the whole time? The easy answer, the one circulating everywhere this morning, is retaliation. Ukraine has been sending drones deep into Russian territory for months, and now Russia is supposedly getting tough, finally responding in kind. It's a clean story. It fits a narrative we already believe, that Russia reacts, that Russia is provoked into action rather than acting on its own logic. But look at what was actually hit. Not apartment blocks, not shopping centers, not the civilian infrastructure you'd expect from a punishment campaign designed to break public morale. The targets were military-industrial. Roughly 20 people died, according to independent Ukrainian reporting. That is a tragedy for every one of those 20 families, and nothing here minimizes that. But 20 deaths from a strike of that scale is not what a deliberate campaign against civilians looks like. If you wanted to kill civilians with hundreds of missiles and drones, you would kill a great many more than 20. The math doesn't support the punishment campaign theory. What you're actually looking at is something Russia has done repeatedly over 4 years. Large strikes against strategic and industrial targets. Nothing structurally new happened last night except scale. The Kremlin will frame it publicly as a response to the drone raids, because that plays well domestically. It lets Russian leadership tell its own population that this is reactive, not simply what Russian strategy has been doing all along. But strip away the framing, and what remains is continuity, not a turning point. Which brings us to the real question sitting underneath all of this. How deep is outside involvement in the war Russia says it's actually fighting? Because Moscow has never described this as a purely bilateral conflict with Kyiv. And there was a moment this week that should have gotten far more attention than it did. Two pranksters, posing as an EU official, got an advisor to Estonia's president talking on record about coordinating strike data for attacks reaching into St. Petersburg. Russian officials seized on it immediately as confirmation of what they've been alleging for years: direct NATO state participation in operations on Russian soil. And you don't actually need a prank call to establish that outside involvement is real and growing. Go back and read the G7 communiqué from mid-June, after the leaders met in France. It states plainly that member states intend to accelerate support for Ukraine's long-range strike campaign into Russia. Accelerate, not maintain, not review, accelerate. The same statement commits to increasing economic pressure on Moscow. If anyone in the Kremlin still had doubts about Western intentions, that document should have removed them. And reporting out of Kyiv at the time suggested the American president left that meeting more convinced than before that Ukraine's strike campaign was working and should go further, not less. So whatever caution existed earlier in the year appears to be eroding. The West is not stepping back from this. It's leaning in. This matters enormously for where the war goes next, because there is a threshold sitting in front of all of this that nobody in Western capitals seems eager to discuss out loud. What happens the day Russia decides the cost of restraint no longer makes sense? Ukrainian drones have already crossed into Baltic airspace on multiple occasions, and Russia hasn't responded to that. But Russian officials have said clearly that any drone launched from Baltic soil against Russian territory will draw a strike on the launch site itself. That's the most plausible pathway to a direct Russia-NATO confrontation right now, not some grand ideological collision, but a Baltic state allowing its territory to be used as a launch pad and Russia following through on a warning it has already issued. It's precisely because that scenario is so dangerous that none of the Baltic governments have allowed it so far. But set that scenario aside for a moment and ask the harder question. Is Russia getting ready to retaliate directly against Europe for its role in supplying and enabling Ukraine's strike campaign? There's a well-known argument circulating in Russian strategic circles, the idea that Russia should stop tolerating the drone war being waged with Western assistance and start striking the source rather than the proxy. Hit conventional targets in Europe first, and if that doesn't change Western behavior, escalate from there. It's a serious argument made by serious people, and it should be taken seriously rather than dismissed as bluster. The reason it hasn't happened yet probably comes down to two things. First, Russian air defense has been managing the drone threat reasonably well up to this point. Not perfectly, but well enough that the incentive to escalate horizontally into new theaters hasn't reached a breaking point. Second, and this is the part Western audiences rarely hear, the battlefield situation does not remotely resemble the picture painted in most Western media. The idea that Russia is stalled, bleeding out, on the verge of operational collapse, that story just isn't supported by what's actually happening on the ground. Progress has been slow, nobody disputes that. This has been a grinding, methodical advance, not a blitz. But Russia continues to close the remaining ground in Donbass, and there isn't much of that region left to take. As long as the front continues moving in Russia's favor, and the drone threat remains manageable, the incentive to open a second, far more dangerous front against NATO territory stays relatively low. That could change. But right now, that's the actual calculus, not the one being narrated on cable news. And this gets at something deeper than any single battlefield assessment. The danger of raising the pressure on a side that has, until now, absorbed pain rather than escalated in response. Restraint has held specifically because the cost being imposed on Russia has stayed within a range Moscow judged tolerable. Call them pinpricks, painful but survivable, and survivable without requiring a direct confrontation with the alliance backing Ukraine. The entire logic of Russian restraint rests on that calibration holding. The moment Western strategy shifts explicitly toward maximizing pain rather than managing a stalemate, and the G7 language suggests exactly that shift, the coping mechanism that has kept this a proxy war rather than a direct one starts to break down. Because at some point, the question answers itself. If absorbing damage indefinitely is no longer sustainable, and capitulation is politically and strategically impossible, what other option remains besides striking the source of the pressure directly? Nobody wants to say this plainly in Western capitals, but pushing Russia into a corner where restraint no longer serves its interests is not a cost-free strategy. It risks producing exactly the confrontation everyone claims to be trying to avoid. So why are Western governments being so open about all of this now? A $250,000 bounty was floated by alliance officials for strategies to target Russian airfields, announced publicly, not whispered through back channels. Compare that to how carefully covert Western support used to be described even 2 years ago. What changed? There are a few possible explanations. Maybe it's about normalizing the idea in Western publics so that if retaliation does come, it doesn't feel like a shock. Maybe it's meant to reassure European and American audiences that Russia is too weak or too cautious to respond meaningfully, which conveniently serves the argument for staying the course. Or maybe it's simpler than either of those, a signal meant for Washington specifically, proof that supporting Ukraine carries no real risk of wider war, which helps keep American engagement and funding flowing. The more persuasive explanation is less a matter of deliberate strategy and more a matter of belief. A large share of the Western foreign policy establishment, call it the elite consensus, has genuinely convinced itself that a larger confrontation with Russia is coming, regardless of what anyone does now. Not a possibility to be managed, but an inevitability to be prepared for. Under that framing, Ukraine isn't just a country being defended, it's the mechanism by which the West buys time to rearm before the real confrontation arrives. That belief isn't necessarily cynical or manufactured for effect. It's more troubling than that, because sincerely held false beliefs are far harder to dislodge than calculated propaganda. Once a story like that gets repeated enough times inside a closed information environment, it stops being a talking point and becomes the lens through which every new piece of evidence gets interpreted. And once European leaders start talking openly about the inevitability of a larger war, Russia has to respond to that rhetoric as though it were a genuine plan. Because from Moscow's side, why would you assume otherwise? If the other side keeps saying war is coming and keeps preparing accordingly, you prepare too. And once you prepare, Western commentators point to your preparations as proof of the very aggression they predicted in the first place. This is the textbook security dilemma, playing out in close to real time, every defensive move looking offensive to the other side, feeding a spiral neither side fully controls, and neither side seems able to name honestly in public. Now here is where the story gets even harder to reconcile with itself, and it has to do with numbers. Recent reporting, citing a well-known Washington think tank, put Russian deaths somewhere north of 400,000 against Ukrainian deaths in the range of 125 to 150,000. Even taking the high end of the Ukrainian estimate, that's roughly a 3-to-1 ratio favoring Ukraine. Sit with that for a second, because it does not survive contact with basic facts about how this war has actually been fought. Artillery has been the single largest killer on this battlefield for 4 years, and Russia has maintained something like a 5-to-1, possibly 10-to-1 advantage in artillery volume for most of that time. Add in precision-guided glide bombs, which Russia has dropped by the thousands, and Ukraine has essentially none of. Someone might respond that Russia has mostly been on the offensive, and offense typically produces more casualties than defense, true in general. But that argument collapses the moment you remember how much of this war Ukraine itself has spent attacking. The 2023 counteroffensive, the incursion into Kursk, major operations in Kherson and Kharkiv in 2022 that actually succeeded in pushing Russian forces back. Ukraine has been on the offensive for large stretches of this war, which means the casualty asymmetry argument cuts against, not for, the reported numbers. A more defensible estimate, given the firepower disparity and Russia's documented preference for cautious, casualty-averse tactics, would put Ukrainian losses far higher than what's being reported, plausibly in the range of several 100,000 to over 1 million killed, not the low hundreds of thousands being cited. This is not a minor statistical quibble. It is functionally identical to what happened with body counts during the Vietnam War. That's not a rhetorical flourish, it's a structural parallel. In Vietnam, an American command under enormous domestic pressure to show progress inflated enemy casualty figures because body counts became the primary metric the public was offered as proof the war was winnable. Everyone inside that system understood at some level that the numbers being reported didn't match reality on the ground. And crucially, the people producing those numbers usually knew they were producing fiction. The dishonesty in Vietnam was largely conscious. What may be happening today looks different in one important respect. Today's version seems to be believed by the people repeating it, not manufactured with open eyes the way it often was decades ago. That arguably makes it more dangerous, not less, because a knowing lie can eventually be corrected once someone decides to stop lying. A sincerely held false narrative just keeps reproducing itself. And it isn't only casualty figures. Watch how quickly certain assessments get treated as socially unacceptable, regardless of whether they turn out to be accurate. The 2023 counteroffensive was, from very early on, showing every sign of running into prepared Russian defensive lines and stalling badly. And saying so out loud at the time got you accused of doing Russia's work for it. The same pattern played out with the Kursk incursion, an operation that meant abandoning defensive positions to attack into open, hostile territory, which predictably produced brutal losses. Question the sanctions regime's effectiveness from day one, as plenty of economists did on purely technical grounds, and you were treated as making a political statement rather than an empirical one. The pattern repeats constantly. Territorial control gets treated as the primary scoreboard in a conflict that is, by its own internal logic, a war of attrition. A war where you deliberately avoid throwing forces against fortified lines, and instead grind down the other side's capacity to fight, understanding that territory shifts rapidly once a front actually collapses. Measuring a war of attrition by territorial gain is close to a category error, yet it remains the dominant public metric because it produces simpler headlines than casualty ratios do. Compare that to how success got measured in the separate, much shorter conflict with Iran, where the metric shifted entirely to destruction. How many aircraft destroyed, how much of the Navy eliminated. That's a strange metric too, if the actual strategic objective is something like keeping the Strait of Hormuz open, because a country can absorb enormous material losses and still hold a strait shut with cheap, simple drone and missile systems, and can keep producing more of them regardless of casualties, because the political tolerance for pain on that side of the ledger runs very differently than public tolerance runs in Washington or European capitals. On Iran specifically, it's worth being precise about what actually happened, because the framing in most coverage tends to blur two very different phases into one continuous, quote, war. There was an air campaign lasting roughly 6 weeks that ended not because objectives were achieved, but because munitions stocks were being drawn down faster than they could be replaced, and because a ground option was never seriously on the table. Nobody was willing to accept the casualty levels a ground invasion would require. After the bombing stopped, the conflict shifted to a naval blockade, which itself ended once a memorandum of understanding got signed. No ground war ever happened, which means the entire casualty exchange framework that applies to Ukraine simply doesn't map onto Iran. It's a fundamentally different kind of conflict, measured by fundamentally different indicators. And on the substance of that memorandum, only one of the two real objectives has been achieved so far. The strait reopened, oil started flowing again, including Iranian oil, priced in dollars, specifically to keep global energy markets from spiraling. That was always the easier of the two goals, because Iran has its own overwhelming interest in selling that oil. The far harder objective, some updated version of a nuclear constraint agreement, remains completely unresolved. And sitting on top of that unresolved nuclear question are 4 enormous economic issues nobody has settled. Reparations reportedly running near $300 billion, unfreezing well over $100 billion in frozen assets, lifting sanctions comprehensively, and resolving a proposed transit fee structure for the strait itself. Every one of those favors Iran if conceded, and Iran deliberately structured the negotiating sequence to hold the nuclear issue until last, precisely because it understood that once the strait reopened, its only remaining source of leverage was the nuclear file. That was a shrewd negotiating decision, and it puts the other side in a genuinely difficult position. Either make sweeping economic concessions that leave Iran considerably stronger regionally than it was before any of this started, or walk away without a nuclear agreement and accept the much higher risk that Iran moves toward an actual weapons capability, which in turn raises the odds of a far more dangerous Israeli response somewhere down the road. There is no clean way out of that bind, and there's no credible military option left to force a better outcome, because going back to bombing risks closing the strait right back up, and the stockpile problem that ended the air campaign in the first place hasn't gone away. Zoom out from any single conflict, and a larger pattern becomes hard to miss. During the Cold War, there was a fairly disciplined hierarchy of priorities. The Western Hemisphere mattered most, but required almost no active management because there was no serious rival there. Europe and East Asia mattered because that's where the other great powers were. The Persian Gulf mattered because of oil, and for a long stretch of that period, allies handled most of the actual burden there. That was a strategy with real discipline behind it, because it was built around a single organizing threat.
None of that discipline exists right now. The current administration has simultaneously escalated activity across 4 separate theaters at once, deepening military and political engagement in the Western Hemisphere in ways that go well beyond anything seen in decades, staying entangled in an unresolved and expensive confrontation with Iran in the Gulf, re-engaging more deeply in Ukraine as the battlefield situation shifts, and continuing to treat East Asia as what planners call the pacing threat, the one theater nobody is willing to deprioritize under any circumstance. Trying to sustain serious commitments in all 4 at once, simultaneously, is not a strategy. A strategy requires choosing what matters most and accepting the cost of not doing everything else. What's happening instead looks more like an assumption, largely unexamined, that reach and capability are unlimited, an inherited habit from a much shorter unipolar moment that doesn't automatically carry over into a world with more genuine centers of power. And underneath all 4 of those theaters sits a problem that rarely gets attention until it's too late to fix cheaply. The industrial capacity to actually sustain a serious, prolonged conflict has eroded badly. The 6-week air campaign against Iran ran down precision munitions stockpiles fast enough to force an end to the bombing on its own, independent of whether the strategic objectives had been met. Reconstituting those stockpiles is going to take years, not months. Layer the national debt trajectory on top of that industrial shortfall, and a fairly stark picture emerges. A security posture stretched across 4 regions simultaneously, backed by a manufacturing base that cannot currently sustain even one prolonged, high-intensity conflict, let alone several at once. If there's a genuine lesson sitting inside these last several years, Ukraine, then Iran, and everything now unresolved in the Gulf, it's this one. Trying to prioritize everything, all the time, in every region, is functionally identical to prioritizing nothing at all. Eventually, reality forces the choice that strategy was supposed to make in advance. The only real question left is whether that choice gets made deliberately while there's still room to choose, or whether it gets made for us under conditions nobody would have picked.